Hello and welcome. I'm Eric Miskell and welcome to this edition of EMSNOW Up Close. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing a very unique and special guest. Dr. Alan Yeung is one of your Renaissance achievers. He is an author, entrepreneur, investor, and senior technology executive, having worked throughout the United States and Asia. Alan is most recently known for his work with Foxconn, having led their 2017 multi-billion-dollar US investment project. Prior to his departure from Foxconn just over a year ago, Alan was Foxconn's US Director of Strategic Initiatives and top executive in North America. Alan recently released his latest book, Flying Eagle, which was the code name for Foxconn's $10 billion investment project in the United States. In this part one of a two-part series, the book Flying Eagle tells the story of how Foxconn's chairman, Terry Gou, decided to partner with the Trump administration to onshore electronics manufacturing to America. What many people don't know is that Alan is also an educator, inventor, and holder of multiple US patents. He received his bachelor's in chemical engineering from the University of Wisconsin, his MBA from UC Berkeley, and a PhD from Stanford University. Alan has been fortunate to lead more than a dozen projects from emerging technology startups to multi-billion-dollar international ventures. He has served as a senior executive throughout Silicon Valley and the Asian Pacific market, and is currently a professor of practice for entrepreneurship at the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater. So please welcome Dr. Alan Yeung. Alan, good to have you on the show today. Good to be able to speak to you and get your insights. And this is fascinating. I've been looking forward to this, but why don't we begin by tell us about the work you did and the role you played within Foxconn to reshore manufacturing back to the United States.
Good morning, Eric. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you and your readers and audiences. Well, the project Flying Eagle was a very ambitious and pioneering effort, actually going back to 2017. I think at the time, there were discussions about reshoring electronics and other manufacturing capacity back to North America, especially in the United States. And as you know, a lot of the capacity over the years had moved to offshore, and a lot of those eventually went to China. So it was a challenge, and I think SoftBank chairman Masa-san actually enlisted Terry Gou and Foxconn to help to consider that investment. So that's how I got involved, and that's how I got started there.
Okay, and what was that like? What was that process like? Tell us a little bit about kind of the thinking and how that was planned back then.
I think it was very early on back then, and I can give you anecdotal stories such as when we were looking at bringing back the investment and the capacity, clean room and other equipment were actually manufactured by a lot of the American names, which are the same vendors that would supply into the semiconductor industry. But most of their production capacity and the customers were all in Asia Pacific, namely Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and mainland China. So in essence, we were not just coming back here ourselves. We also have to work with the suppliers and vendors to build the equipment, the facilities. But the key for us back then is to really gauge the commitment up and down for our partners in the government, from the federal government in the White House, and also with state governments in various states that we had actually spoken to, along with the local authorities. So it's a very compressed timetable, and it was an ambitious endeavor. We tried to really actually make it happen in a very short period of time. And that was actually quite a bit before reshoring was even coined as a phrase or as a term.
Right, and you know, it's interesting because, and I want to be very clear for our audience too, you no longer work for Foxconn, so comments you're making are obviously a reflection back on what has happened prior to, you know, prior to a year ago. So although you probably have some thoughts, but I won't ask you about what's currently going on. But let's talk about that, the reshoring. In terms of reshoring, you've mentioned some about bringing the supply chain, but what are the challenges involved in doing so? And how do you think those challenges are best overcome?
Well, there are partners that we have to gauge and really seek out and eventually sign on with. The commitment from the White House is important. Whether it was President Trump or somebody else, it didn't matter as much as whether they really are keen on making it happen. And our meetings in the White House over various period and time really impressed on us that the administration was serious in supporting us. And in meeting with the state government, various governors, we also arrived at the same conclusion. But some of the challenges that we face, I had mentioned that in my book. Essentially, we were looking at cost, we are looking at speed, and of course, also the talent. In China and other places, we were very much used to having the best cost position on all the input factors, including the cost of constructing the factory, but also the logistics and supply chain, along with the labor costs, and also some of the red tape and regulatory challenges that we may have faced. At that tie also into the speed. In China and other places, you would get a straight answer from the local authorities whether certain permits can be granted and what kind of remedial actions you have to take to make it happen. Whereas in some other places, including certain places in the United States, there are other uncertainties. You don't know whether it will work. You don't know whether it takes only a week or usually not. Several months, it could tie into quite a long time. The kind of uncertainties add to the cost and make the project sometimes very expensive, and other times it's really even impossible. But the biggest challenge is still the talent pool. We call it human infrastructure, meaning that some of the electronics manufacturing talent had either aged and retired, and the new ones were actually all in Asia Pacific. So we had to put a training plan together and really budget a huge amount of resources to really train up the local authority and to train up the talent pool over there so that we can work together as a partner. I think that was the biggest challenge. And I think now with a few years later, with the Sino-US trade war, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the situation and war in Ukraine, it makes the supply chain even more expensive and the talent pool even more difficult to really pull together.
Yeah. And I recall that Foxconn did have a footprint within the Americas already at that time. I believe in the United States, it was in the Houston area. And but the decision was made, obviously, not to just expand an existing site. The decision was made to greenfield and to go in that direction. And it sounds like from your comments that the decision was really kind of from considering the supply base and what's best in the reshoring and doing a regional approach, build in region for region, rather than a politically motivated activity. Is that correct? Or?
Well, the politics were not the factor, but I think the business environment, the investment climate were a very major factor for our decision making. We always believe in critical mass. And if you look at the growth that we have done in mainland China and later on Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, and now in India and other places, Foxconn is a very purposeful and intentful company looking very long term. So we would look at how we can build up a site which would be sizable in terms of investment compared to the China sites. But at the same time, if you spread out too much, it would be very challenging to have critical mass. So at that time, we would build up the TFT fab and the downstream manufacturing capacity, the R&D staff. Later on, we add on to the North America headquarters staff. The idea was to go to one site first and then build up the capability, have the critical mass, and then we can expand from there. But it would take a few years to get there. As you can tell from my book, we had actually two sites in mind, one in Wisconsin, which is Mount Pleasant, and later we include Milwaukee as our headquarters. and maybe other sites for innovation centers. But we also look at Columbus, Ohio as a second site. That didn't happen, partly because some of the decisions made when the market condition change, but also our local partners endeavor also had some changes there. But suffice it to say, Houston and Texas in general is still a very good investment environment and a great state and a partner that we have back then and now. We also have facilities in other places like California and Indianapolis and also Virginia. But the decision was to build up Wisconsin and put our investment there and work with our local partners to make it work.
Okay. So tell me about that, the decision-making process. When deciding where to reshore and locate this, what are the considerations in terms of regulatory and tax policies that needed to be considered?
Well, I think the tax and the regulatory policies are important. As I said before, we need to level the playing field. I mean, by definition, there's a cost differential of building and doing business in Asia versus in North America. We recognize that. Some of the tax credits incentive can also mitigate a portion of it, but in reality, there will be a gap. What we didn't want to have is a deficit in terms of speed, in terms of cost, and in terms of support for talent development coming from the local and the state government. And in Wisconsin and in Ohio, we saw very progressive and very capable leadership that give us confidence that we should do that. So I mentioned that before, in terms of environmental remediation and permit applications, in some cases, we would go beyond the local requirements, such as 1.2 acre for 1 acre for wetland remediation. We went to 2 acres per 1 acre. And that was a partnership that we work with the local and state government. By the same token, if there are redundancy in terms of review and permits, they were able to meet our requirement quickly without skipping or actually cutting corners, but you don't have to drag it out for a long, long time. That was a key. But on talent, we look at the Upper Midwest as an area with a lot of manufacturing heritage. Manufacturing for electronics, for automobile had always been there. The last few years, you lost a lot of that in places like Wisconsin, Illinois, but you still have tremendous amount of resources, both in those states, but also in places like Michigan or Ohio. So we like the Midwest a lot. We look at North Carolina, we thought it would be interesting and we would have gone there, but I think that the focus at that time was Upper Midwest. And Pennsylvania was very interesting to us too, partly because even though we have Democratic governors in Governor Tom Wolf, and the same case for North Carolina with Governor Cooper, we like the leadership and we would have gone there. So it's not politics. Pennsylvania was a bit more expensive in terms of tax burden. And when we calculate the total cost of ownership and conducting business there, it was a little bit that give us a pause looking at Pennsylvania. But for other cases, it might still be very interesting. Yeah.
And I know that when we spoke previously, you had talked about you found that Upper Midwest to be, I think you named 4 states at the time, really the most attractive regions within the United States. Is it just because of the reasons you just mentioned, or was there something else about that too? Because I do know, and I teased you before, I know you went to the University of Wisconsin, but you assured me that that had nothing to do with the ultimate decision to land there. So
I swear that's actually true. And but we do provide staff input to our chairman, Terry Gold. And of course, he was the ultimate decision maker. If you look at the TFT LCD fab, which is Gen 10.5 that we were looking at, the logistics and supply chain cost was a key factor, because depending on your math, the size of the TV and the TV panel, you could be easily looking at a $75 to $150 cost differential, making it in Asia Pacific versus doing it here in North America. Maybe partnering with some of the factories in Mexico, or do it entirely in places in Upper Midwest. So for that reason, Ohio being very close to the Eastern Seaboard was actually the prime location. We look at the site called Wickebacker with a lot of the logistics, including air and rail and highway, that would have been the best Gen 10.5 site. We end up picking Wisconsin for that. That would still be a second choice. But if you look at what that means nowadays, what would be very interesting for reshoring is actually EV, electric vehicles.
Yes.
If it costs more to ship or transport TV from Asia to North America, it costs a lot more for electric vehicles. So therefore, places like Ohio and to some extent places like Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan are all still very attractive places.
Okay. Now, you bring up a good point there, because as you're speaking to the network of facilities that companies like Foxconn do have. And it's never just one facility against the rest. It's really the whole network. So from a supply chain perspective, in terms of how to balance the supply chain in terms of global manufacturing footprint in order to mitigate risk, what are your thoughts on that?
I think 5 years ago, the idea was looking at North America, not just the United States, but how to combine Canada and Mexico into the US to be more regional. I think within my book, I mentioned about the so-called G2, the world go from globalization to, bifurcation of two regional supply chains. That was something that our chairman, Terry Goh, foresaw maybe 7 or 8 years ago. That's happening now for different reasons beyond just the trade war. So Mexico play a key role. So how you can tie that into either the Texas and the Carolinas and some of the southern states, but by looking at EV and potentially even semiconductor, we could also look at the upper Midwest. But the key point really is that you have a talent pool and you have a lot of the higher education, such as my alma mater, University of Wisconsin, and other universities, which really have produced a lot of engineers and will continue to be the actually force to be reckoned with. So you want to be close to this higher education institution. But by the same token, we talk about de-risking. If you put all your fab in one location, be it in places like Arizona and Texas, these are great states for semiconductor manufacturing, but at some point it's going to get a little bit more saturated. So we believe the upper Midwest still have ways to go. I think the recent case in point is Intel decision going to Columbus, Ohio to build their fab there. And Wisconsin will have its chance. We just have to be longer term looking. And a lot of your readers and audience know, because they are from the EMS industry, our goal really is to create an environment and other capability so that we can serve our partners and clients when the opportunity comes. You never know it's going to be next month or next year, but you need to be there. You need to have the capability, capacity, the staff, but at the end, the short time lead time is actually very, very crucial. But if you go beyond North America, the global supply chain is now looking very interesting. If you see Vietnam and India now playing a very key role as some of the de-risking is happening out of mainland China, other places such as the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, is becoming actually very, very attractive, partly because they have a government partnership that is stable, that's very supportive in terms of creating a business environment that will attract foreign investment. By the same token, I think being close to the coastal area would harken back now into inbound logistics. If you look at what happened 20 years ago, some of the Eastern European factories like Hungary and Czech Republic, we see, at least I personally see, some of that could be happening now in the coastal places such as Vietnam, India, and the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia.
That's interesting. But what about the material supply chain then, Alan? You know, because that's always putting the manufacturing someplace. It's been said, you mentioned Mexico, over 90% of the components that are assembled into products in Mexico are imported from Asia, right? So
Mhm.
do you see a concurrent kind of an effort to diversify and reshore, kind of regionalize the material supply chain?
Absolutely. I think it's going to take a while. It depends on maybe international trade or geopolitical events that are happening. And you continue to see that every day and every week and every month. But nobody knows the timing thereof. It's hard to see whether TFT LCD will actually be built in North America. We said that 5 years ago we were going to do that. I continue to be optimistic at some point that you don't want all your heads-up display for your F-35 jet fighters made in Asia Pacific unless you stock up a lot of those, and that will be a cost there. But coming back to your question about rebuilding or reshoring or maybe regionalizing some of the supply chain, they will do that, you know, in places like India and Vietnam and potentially the Middle East, because those are low-cost locations to do. Whereas rebuilding PCB and other fundamental or supply chains where high volume, low cost, and also inbound, outbound logistic cost is very critical, Upper Midwest may not be the place. So I would be optimistic that, you know, with the kind of partnership in government, you could see some of that being, you know, placed, invested elsewhere. But in North America, Mexico will play a key role, and over there in India and the Middle East, they will become a new force there. But one thing for sure, though, is that I think site selection, business attraction, is going to go into a new gear, meaning some of the agency that we worked with 5 years ago were superb, but I think everybody is very competitive. They learn from themselves and each other and what worked, and there are not too many mega projects out there like the Foxconn or Intel project. So if you have a good business environment, you have a chance for the next project. But I think the latest, what I've seen is going into quasi partnership. If you read some of the news and maybe look at what the Saudi government is speaking with Foxconn about, the $9 billion project entail a lot of things that the company also talking about putting in places like Ohio and potentially considering Wisconsin in the past. So our project here went from 10 billion to 1 billion in Wisconsin, and the other 9 could be somewhere else. That tells you if we start attacking the company and make it a little bit uncomfortable, people have choices, they would go somewhere else. Now, the Saudi government or other agencies such as Jobs Ohio could come up with a very creative partnership. And I think I'm not involved in the negotiation at all over there in Saudi Arabia, but they are taking a look at maybe taking equity stake, maybe being a partner, not just as a local government, but having equity and other financial interest in the deal. That means they're even more committed. And that actually is creative, and that's actually risk-taking. But I think that will be something we should look at maybe for the years to come. More and more agency and government may actually go that route.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The other term that I hear when in recent discussions of reshoring, especially, and with supply chain questions, is the term deglobalization. The people are talking about this deglobalization. What are your thoughts on that? How do you view that?
That's a very good question, Eric. I don't think anybody really have the crystal ball, and the answers are still out there. And I think the biggest challenge and the wild card right now is the war in Ukraine, and it's a very unfortunate situation. But taking aside that and also the war and the geopolitics, I think the 3 shocks, the world supply chain and trade, meaning the Sino-US war, trade war, the pandemic due to COVID-19, and now very, very this unfortunate conflict in Eastern Europe, tells the world that they need to de-risk and they need to look at the total cost of ownership. And also, if I have 100 or 1,000,000 units of product made, how do I make sure my supply chain will be robust and also would not be that easily broken? So maybe a high-end product could be made in a place which would be a little bit more costly to build and manufacture. Maybe you can average out the total cost, working with your partner or customer or client, that 100 units will cost a little bit more if you have 5 or 10 of those in places in the US. I mean, we saw that in my former employer. Some of the lead products for the company that make phones, many of us use that, including me. The lead products development, the first articles were made in Shenzhen. And later on, when they scale up, they would move some of that or all of that to the campus in Zhengzhou, for example. And likewise for the notepad or iPad, they would do the same. So you have multiple locations for manufacturing. But as a partnership between the EMS and the OEM, we need to recognize the cost cannot be all minimized and optimized with no margin of error. I think that's really the key here. And that is now telling us, based on the COVID situation in China, it is telling us big time we need to rethink, but also look at the cost and the risk involved. Just harken back to maybe about 15 or even 15 years ago. I'm not going to go beyond by dating myself here. I used to work for another ODM EMS company called Inventor Corporation. I was a vice president of corporate strategy and eventually leading a IT service there as well. At that time, 85% of the world's notebook computer were made in the Shanghai Kunshan area. So what that means at that time was about 100 to 125 million units of notebook PC. 85% of that were made in 2 factories in Shanghai and 2 factories in Kunshan. And if you have a snowstorm, which actually happened once in Shanghai, you actually have a stoppage, and all these trucks going into the Pudong airport got blocked. That was 17 or 15 years ago, and 85 to 90 millions of units could not ship out by plane in Shanghai. So now, fast forward to current time and current date, I think the world needs to look at how we can, from an actual standpoint, from a robust, supply chain and business continuity standpoint, how do you factor all these costs?
Yeah. It's interesting. I had the fortunate experience prior in my career to work with a very smart gentleman in EMS, and the way he used to talk about supply chain risk, he said the number one factor are time zones. How many time zones you put between where it's ordered and where it's fulfilled. He says the more time zones, the higher the risk, right? So that was his, and I think about that today as people are, it went big and now things are coming back in region for region. In Europe, they call it local for local, but that strategy seems to be the winning one these days in EMS.
It's very interesting. I think you're absolutely correct, Eric. 15 years ago and until about 5 years ago, the world is trying to optimize to the lowest cost. And when you see products in Walmart or Target or Best Buy, is absolutely the lowest cost you can get there, and assume everything worked. Yeah. But when you have a snowstorm, when you have a supply shortage, when you have a pandemic, it breaks, and therefore now when you have an event, it costs you on business continuity. I think now people are looking at how do you regionalize, how do you shorten some of the supply chain, but also how do you have redundancy, and part of that also is serving the local market as well. So I would go back to places or, the area that I'm very interested in, which is Upper Midwest, Wisconsin, maybe Ohio, Michigan, and places like that. So the EV market is very interesting for reshoring, and I think your audience and readers would agree that if there's local content to be had, and there are also some restrictions and some considerations in terms of making sure the balance of trade is there, EV would be the place that you want to be a supplier and also be part of the global supply chain. And there's a regionalization that we can be quite comfortable is happening. And also you need to be local and be close to the market, partly because shipping systems and subsystems and chassis is difficult, but also serving a local market, having all your marketing and sales resources elsewhere is just not possible. Also, it's good to have your design team here. So I think that would be interesting. The other one to look at is when we look at, the government would play a role to at least level the playing field. 5 years ago, when we spoke with the Trump administration, we had said it multiple times that in terms of manufacturing, especially electronics manufacturing, the United States need to actually get a new trade status called a developing country. In other words, everything left in terms of originally outsourcing and then offshoring. And therefore, you want to rebuild that in the United States, we need to get favorable treatment. We need to actually have some help, and we need to have the WTO trade status to allow us to have some protection or fostering in one hand, and on the other hand, allow us to rebuild that electronics supply chain and manufacturing base. So things such as allowing you to bring in components and subsystems without tax, and also maybe allow you to have some market share because you're rebuilding critical supply chain, which also might have dual users, would be very, very important. We brought that up with the last administration, and I think the current administration will be well served to look at that. But I think the encouraging thing is it's happening with EV, it's happening with semiconductor, with the CHIPS Act. So those are encouraging things under the current administration.
Yeah, that's very good. So what are some of the lessons learned from your experience that you can share with other EMS that might be kind of helpful in them as they're managing through these times? And you have a rich history there within the industry. What are some of kind of the major lessons learned that you could impart to other EMS who may be watching?
Okay, well, I have some market opportunities or thoughts I can share, but also how to work with and maybe cope with some of the challenges of working here in North America and the United States. I mentioned COVID-19 pandemic. Foxconn in Wisconsin and globally made a gallant effort to get into face mask, ventilator, and other medical devices, and diagnostics and testing equipment and devices. I think the effort's still ongoing. Some of that has been more stealth and maybe even carved out somewhere. But if you look at what is interesting the past few years, and I think still will continue, even though the pandemic may have now been downgraded to endemic, is that there are a lot of opportunity for medical and healthcare and biotech from an ODM, from a EMS perspective, in places like Utah, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and some of the areas or states like North Carolina. So I think that is interesting, partly because you have some of the regulatory requirement that you need to have the GMP and also some of the certification for your manufacturing site. So medium-sized, even emerging companies have great opportunity to be successful here in the US, unlike electronics, making phones and laptops and even servers would be challenging. Another area, of course, would be some of the dual use and defense and really high-tech and aerospace applications that has some implication for national defense. And I think that was something that we looked at 5 years ago. Unfortunately, because Foxconn is not a US company, there are certain things that we were restricted in terms of doing, even though many of us were American citizens. But companies like Intel or other American firms would not have that problem or challenges. By the same token, I think some of the supply chain and EMS capability could be built up for those areas, biotech or medical, dual use, defense, and some of the very challenging, harsh environment that they need to operate with. Switching gear into maybe some of your clients and readers are not from here in the United States. They could be from Europe, or they could be from Asia Pacific, including Taiwan or Korea, and even mainland China, wanting to actually build capability, create jobs, and really make products here for themselves or on behalf of the client. You need to understand that we are very transparent society. So everything you do is subject to scrutiny, and you need to be very transparent. And unlike in places like mainland China or other countries where when you go and create jobs and really make investment, most of the time is very supportive. You don't see very negative voices, and you only see some constructive criticism. Here, because of politics, and sometimes it's not just geopolitics, but local, state, and even federal and presidential politics, you get caught into it. And that's unfortunate. That's true for our project. We try to get out of it. If you look at how the company operate, Foxconn has been very, very restrained and reserved in being vocal, but just quietly doing its work and making efforts to actually create jobs and getting clients to actually give orders to make products in Wisconsin. Those are the things that we are learning and continue to learn. And I think other fellow EMS coming to the United States will be well served in picking the right environment to work with, but also being mindful that there will be critics, and some will be very constructive, and we welcome that. Others will be a little bit more politics, and therefore you have to deal with it and you have to live with it.
Yeah, that's unfortunately is life in the United States these days.
Yes.
So that's truly.
Well, we liked the bipartisanship back in Wisconsin back then, and I think we will be best served to get back into that for the years to come, and that remains to be my wish.
Yeah, well, mine too. I would share that with you, Alan. So our time is coming to an end, and I just want to say thank you to you, sir. This has been, your insights are fantastic. It's my first opportunity to speak to somebody from the Foxconn ecosystem, and so I've certainly appreciated this. I do look forward. I have not received your book yet. Our interview came together very quickly, so I do look forward to reading it. My editor did read it very quickly and gave you a thumbs up. So I would recommend that to our audience as well, that, to look up for that. And it is the first in a series, it said too. So there's a second one planned. What is that? Can you say anything or?
Yes, the first book is called Flying Eagle, and actually is the term that Chairman Terry Gold coined. And it really represents the spirit of actually reinvesting in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's how actually we perceive and conceive the project. Within that book, we talk about some of the work behind the scenes that people trying to overcome challenges and actually make it happen, and therefore resulting in the announcement and the investment coming to Wisconsin and actually other places within the United States, because the supply chain is not just in Wisconsin. Right. My next book is going to be carrying on that storyline, the narrative, how we build up the site here, and how we actually work with local partners, be it academic partners such as universities and colleges and technical college institutions, to really build up the technical and the talent pool there, and also work with the local government to really build up some of the resources in the project, including widening up the interstate to actually make it logistically more feasible, but also creating projects that would actually support building more infrastructure, maybe stimulating some of the local economy. We tried that with smart city, smart future project. We tried it with autonomous vehicle project. We also built up some of the projects that work with not just in Racine County, but going to other places within Wisconsin and really make an attempt to build innovation centers. So those are things that I would mention and talk about. Unfortunately, because of the investment environment, but also the decision by both parties, which is the state of Wisconsin and Foxconn, to tremendously scale back the investment from $10 billion to now $1.6 billion, some of the work may not happen. So me being outside the company now, give me more opportunity to do things that I had envisioned and planned for, but now outside Foxconn and try to make it happen as a private citizen, so to speak.
Oh,
And the new book's title, and I'll share that with your audience, is going to be called Wisconn Valley.
Wisconn Valley. Ah, very good. I like that. You know, it's funny, my editor actually lives in Illinois, just south of the Wisconsin border, and she travels up there. And she did tell me that it is familiar with the site. She says the best part is that the road to the airport now is beautiful. So what you were talking about, the infrastructure there, that was the improvements made in the area were evidently quite substantial. So
it really benefit Illinois and Chicago and O'Hare on one hand, but also Wisconsin in total. When we talked to US DOT back then and really try to get the funding, we got $180 million or so from the federal government, and basically about 85% of what we asked for, whereas Georgia asked for about $550 million, and they got about 220. The rest of the funding, the state of Wisconsin backstopped that. So that pulled the project up by almost 10 years and make it an 8-lane highway from Chicago O'Hare all the way to Milwaukee. And it really supported logistics and supply chain into Minnesota and into some of the western state when you look at I-94 going forward. And that makes that area, southeast Wisconsin, now I would say the logistic capital of the upper Midwest, because Wisconsin being low cost, being a lot more supportive, partnering with Illinois and O'Hare and Chicago being really the 800-pound gorilla, really can radiate into a lot of areas on in terms of warehousing and logistics. So you see a lot of investment, coming up with companies like Uline and Amazon, making a lot of investment in southeast Wisconsin, and Haribo and other companies redoubling their investment there. So we take a little bit of pride and maybe a small amount of credit being a contributor to that effort.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing more about that because, as I told you when we first spoke, I'm also a son of Wisconsin myself, having been born there. So it is one that is still near and dear to my heart. So it's good to hear the updates that we're going from just being a dairy state to kind of being a high-tech center now. So that's great.
That's great.
That's good. Alan, I hope we get to do this again sometime. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you today. And I wish you good luck in getting the second book done. And I look forward to reading the first one as soon as it arrives.
Thanks for having me, Eric. I'm looking forward to speaking with you again soon.
Very good. Take good care. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.